No, instead, they are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, as it says here. And therefore, their behavior toward the fellow man and especially their behavior toward God, their creator, is inexcusable. And the question is why? Well, verse 19 tells us why. Because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, since that time, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, through creation, in other words, so that they are without excuse. No excuse, it says here. And in these verses, he gives two reasons why mankind is without excuse. There are two indisputable witnesses of God's existence and his divine nature. In fact, every person on earth, from the college professors on the universities to the headhunters in New Guinea, they've heard from these two witnesses. Here's the first one. The first one is the inner witness, according to verse 19, where it says, that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Well, how's that? Well, that's through our heart or through our moral conscience. And also through our mind, a man's ability to think and to reason. And then on top of that, what Ecclesiastes 3:11 tells us, that God has made everything beautiful in his time. But look at this next part. He has also set eternity in the hearts of man. That's what God did for us. In other words, the way our conscience is wired up, there's something that's just intuitive within the heart of man that just makes him aware of just the consciousness of God. And because God made mankind for his eternal purpose, nothing will bring us complete satisfaction until this happens, until we find our purpose in him. Now, it's interesting that every culture on every continent has this awareness of God. Every culture on every continent. And it's a consciousness of a power that's greater than themselves. And the reason is because this belief in God is, again, something that's intuitive. It comes from something that's just natural. It's just from within us. In fact, you have to be taught not to believe in God. You've got to be instructed not to do so. In fact, Adrian Rogers, he told a story, about this man who owns a trucking company in the South. And so they give a lie detector test to prospective employees. And one of the questions they ask is that, do you believe in God? Now, you can only get away with that in the South, okay, when you ask that kind of question. But he asks this question, and he says that even when someone claims to be an atheist, the polygraph says they're lying. Isn't that interesting? Now, I don't know if that's true, but I think that's funny. It really is. But the reality is that we know for sure is that apologists, what they will do, or anthropologists, excuse me, they'll point out that every culture, throughout history, has some form of worship of God or some idol they call God here. And that awareness, what that is something that God has created within our being, that desire for us to worship. And so we're wired up that way. It's kind of like it's part of our DNA. And this inclination is unique only to man, not to the animal or plant kingdom. I mean, that's why you'll never see a dog on his knees thanking God for his food. You ever see that? Your puppy probably doesn't do that either, And so number one, verse 19 tells us that there is what's called the inner witness that God put in our hearts. No excuse. And number two, there is the outer witness that God has made clearly evident, and that's through creation, or as it says here in verse 20, what God has made. It says again, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Well, how's that? Being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And so the Bible says here that even though God is invisible, you can clearly see who he is simply by the things that he has made. And if we would just truly study creation that's all around us, I tell you what, we have a difficult time denying that there is a designer, an intelligence that's behind the design, a creator. And in the past few decades, what's really cool, in our generation in particular, is that we have placed these telescopes into space now. I mean, we've got one on Haleakala, but I tell you, the ones that go into space these last few decades, man, astrophysicists have just been so excited that they've made all these profound discoveries. And one of which, that we are discovering that we're living in, our universe is so huge, but our universe is expanding still. And this Big Bang theory, the Big Bang theory, now is a reality. Number two. And scientists now have the proof that one moment of time, all things were created. Now, I came across this quote from Robert Jastrow, who is by no means a theologian. He is one of the world's leading astrophysicists who just passed away, by the way, this last year. His name is Robert Jastrow. Now, he was the founding director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And so this was his take. And this is from all the new discoveries that they've been making. He says, now we see how the astronomical evidence supports the biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are now the same. Consider the enormousness of the problem. Science has proved that the universe exploded into being at a certain given moment. It asks, what cause produced this effect? Who or what put the matter and energy into the universe? Then he goes on to say, science cannot answer this question. And so with that, Robert Jastrow, he made this final comment. I'll try to put it up here. I think we have it up here. And this is what he says. He says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of his own reason, the story ends now like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. He has pulled himself over the final rock and is greeted by a band of theologians who have been there for centuries. Centuries of time. Isn't that great? I get a bang out of that. How about you guys? Big bang. I mean, incredible. Robert Jastrow. Now you got to think about it for a moment. Let's press in a little bit deeper because we need to reason together. Have you ever observed order coming out from an explosion? Think about that. I mean, does an explosion result in chaos, or does it express itself in order? For example, back in 2001, the Twin Towers in New York, it collapsed because of an explosion that was caused by these jet airliners that were filled with fuel crashing into them. Well, a few years ago, what's really interesting, they took the scrap, from these Twin Towers. And what they did, ironically, was they formed it into a Navy vessel. Remember that? In fact, last year it was launched. It was named the USS New York, which was christened with these words. On September 2001, our nation's enemies brought their fight to New York. The USS New York will now bring the fight to our nation's enemies well into the future. Now, consider this. I mean, did this ship just somehow magically, miraculously appear from the wreckage of these towers? Absolutely not. I mean, we recognize that it took, this design and energy to build that particular ship. I mean, it's a no-brainer here. Now, with that in mind, one of the known laws of physics is what's called the second law of thermodynamics. And it states that things move from order to chaos, which is directly opposite of what we know as evolution. And according to this law, the universe is winding down. And stars, the temperature of the stars are decreasing, things slow down, eventually disintegrating. Some of the stars we see right now are not even existent. They're that far away. But things have been winding down